Okay.
But so without further ado, I'd like to thank David for stepping up and welcome him to our little group.
Oh, you're done.
David, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to give greetings to the members of the Worcester chapter of the Torch Club International, and to thank Margot Stone for inviting me to give a program tonight, and thank the members of the organization for giving me this platform to share some information about the Founding Fathers, and to thank Mike Picard for making the technical arrangements. And let me now share my screen because I have a slideshow here. Can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, we're ready to go with that. What your teachers didn't tell you about the Founding Fathers. One of the embarrassing problems for early 19th century champions of the Christian faith was that not one of the first 6 presidents of the United States was an Orthodox Christian. Forward. Here they are: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Most of the founders were deists, roughly the equivalent of Unitarians, who doubted that Christ was God and yet praised his message of compassion. They spoke of God as a power behind nature as discerned by science. And I want to put their views in the context of the times. Disbelief, of course, has always been partly hidden, if not entirely hidden, because it entails risk. For example, I don't know, this should be Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, was a Unitarian clergyman, caused a public outrage with his writings, precipitating in 1791 a riot in which his home, church, and laboratory were burned. So in 1819, British author-journalist Richard Carlisle, whose writings question Christianity, was jailed for 6 years for blasphemous libel. Oh, there he is, okay. When Thomas Jefferson entered the Virginia House of Delegates in 1776, state laws still decreed death for heresy and 3 years in prison for doubting the Trinity. Along with Madison, George Mason, and other rebels, Jefferson succeeded in halting tax support of the Anglican Church and in passing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, eliminating punishments for disapproved beliefs. Eventually, their efforts gave the world a new principle, the separation of church and state, ending government enforcement of religion. The Founding Fathers, of course, were painfully aware of the bloody wars, the brutal persecutions, and cruel punishments, tortures, and executions that had run rampant throughout Christian Europe for centuries. The Crusades from the 11th through the 15th centuries were variously directed mainly against Muslims, though campaigns were also directed against pagan Slavs, Jews, Russian and Greek Orthodox Christians, Mongols, Cathars, Hussites, Waldensians, Old Prussians, and the political enemies of the popes. The Papal Inquisition began in 1233, instituted by Pope Gregory IX, and functioned as follows. The defendants were not given the names of their accusers. As you listen to these characteristics of the Inquisition, you may be reminded of things that are in the Bill of Rights. Defendants had no right to counsel. The trials were not secret, were not public, they were secret. They were held in the presence of the bishop's representative and stipulated laymen. It was customary to torture the accused. It was customary to torture the witnesses for the accused. Most trials resulted in a verdict of guilty. Burning at the stake was a punishment for unrecanted heresy. Burning was nevertheless rare. A guilty verdict would also result in the confiscation of the offender's property, which led to widespread graft and blackmail. The Spanish Inquisition was instituted in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, was more highly organized than the Papal Inquisition, and was much harsher and far freer with the death penalty than the Papal Inquisition. Ironically, the Spanish Inquisition included investigations of St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Teresa of Avila, and soon no Spaniard could feel safe. Woodcuts from the Reformation of the 16th century by Roland Bainton. Here are the faithful apprehended. I don't know which faithful are, but given that it was the history of the Reformation, it's probably the Protestant faithful here being rounded up. Here is the execution of a gentleman named Dubourg, with a crowd attending and happy spectators. Here is a picture of Dutch martyrs being burned at the stake. Keep an eye on that pitchfork. Anabaptist martyrs now being not only burned, but pitchforked. Gaetano Ripoll, in July 26, 1826, was the last heretic executed by the Spanish Inquisition. He was a school teacher. He was garroted in Valencia, presumably for having taught deist principles. This is not a picture of him in his classroom, but a picture of a typical classroom of that time. The Spanish Inquisition was definitively abolished on July 15, 1834, by royal decree of Maria Cristina de Bourbon, regent for Isabella II. Note that the Spanish Inquisition was still functioning during the American Revolution, the formation of the new nation, and the first 45 years of the federal government, that is, during the terms of office of our first 7 presidents. Thus, had our first 6 presidents been, and many more of the founding fathers, been citizens of Spain in that era, they would have been in danger of being burned at the stake or of some other form of execution. Their awareness of the above described religious wars and persecutions and brutalities informed and inspired their devotion to ensuring the separation of church and state in the new nation. Benjamin Franklin, in Boston, published bitingly satirical and critical essays against the current religious beliefs and practices while working as an apprentice in his brother's print shop. His brother was consequently jailed for blasphemies, and church leaders protested that he had mocked religion, brought the Holy Scriptures into contempt, and profanely abused the faithful ministers of God. Franklin moved to Philadelphia and then to London, where he wrote a deist pamphlet denying immortality and depicting God as the laws of nature. Later, having returned to Philadelphia, he modified his views, writing for his own use a summary of his beliefs, which affirmed a supreme perfect being, author and father of the gods themselves, and spoke of not one, but of subservient gods as well. Joseph Priestley considered Franklin too radical, saying, "It is much to be lamented that a man of Dr. Franklin's general good character and great influence should have been an unbeliever in Christianity, and also have done so much as he did to make others unbelievers." Thomas Paine. Paine considered Christianity and all other organized religions to be frauds sustained for their own purposes by kings and priests. In England, Paine argued for public education, opportunities for the poor, pensions for the aged, public works for the jobless, and other similar reforms. All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, he said, appear to me no other than human institutions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and to monopolize power and profit. And he said in that also in the Age of Reason, whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and tortuous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half of the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we call it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind. And again he wrote, the world is my country. All mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion. A gentleman named Cardiff quotes him as saying, whence arose all the horrid assassinations of whole nations of men, women, and infants with which the Bible is filled, and the bloody persecutions and torture unto death and religious wars that since the time have laid Europe in blood and ashes? Whence arose they? But from this impious thing called religion, and this monstrous belief that God has spoken to man. And again, Paine wrote, of all the systems of religion that have been invented, there is none more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, more contradictory in itself than this thing called Christianity. Too absurd for belief, too impossible to convince, too inconsistent for practice, it renders the heart torpid or produces only atheists and fanatics. As an engine of power, it serves the purpose of despotism, and as a means of wealth, the avarice of priests. But so far as respects the good of man in general, it leads to nothing here or hereafter. And on the Roman Catholic Church, he said, it was by propagating that belief and supporting it with fire and faggot that she got to keep her temporal power. And finally, in a letter that he wrote, he gave this dateline, quote, Paris, February 21, 1802, since the fable of Christ. Ethan Allen. At his wedding, when the minister asked Allen to pledge to live with Fanny Buchanan of agreeable to the laws of God, Allen halted the ceremony abruptly in protest. The ceremony continued with his pledge only after it was specified this meant the God of nature as envisioned by deists. And when on his deathbed, Allen was told by a minister, General, I fear the angels are waiting for you. The old soldier replied, waiting are they? Waiting are they? Well, God damn them, let them wait. He wrote in Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, I am no Christian. The doctrine of the Trinity is destitute of foundation and tends to superstition and idolatry. There is not anything which has contributed so much to delude mankind in religious matters as mistaken apprehension concerning supernatural inspiration or revelation. And in those parts of the world where learning and science has prevailed, miracles have ceased. But in those parts of it that are barbarous and ignorant, miracles are still in vogue. George Washington. Jefferson wrote in his journal, Gouverneur Morris, an American patriot during the Revolutionary War and Pennsylvania delegate who wrote major portions of the U.S. Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, has often told me that General Washington believed in no more of that system, Christianity, than he himself did. And when Christian chaplains in the army urged Washington to expel a Universalist chaplain who denied the existence of hell, Washington refused. This was Universalist minister John Murray, who had been appointed chaplain of the Rhode Island Regiment. Historian Barry Schwartz reports that George Washington's practice of Christianity was limited and superficial because he himself was not a Christian. He repeatedly declined the church's sacraments, never did he take communion, and when his wife Martha he waited for her outside the sanctuary. Even on his deathbed, Washington asked for no ritual, uttered no prayer to Christ, and expressed no wish to be attended by his representative. John Adams. Urged by his father to enter the clergy, Adams told a friend that while he respected lawyers, he found in clergy the pretended sanctity of some absolute dunces. Later in his life, his correspondence with Jefferson reveals the two to be kindred spirits in matters of religion. Both were deists who rejected the divinity of Christ, but felt they could perceive evidence of God as the designer of the cosmos. They concurred in their scorn for Christianity. Adams wrote, God has infinite wisdom, goodness, and power. He created the universe. He created this speck of dirt and the human species for his glory, and with deliberate design of making 9/10 of our species miserable forever for his glory. This is the doctrine of the Christian theologians, in general 10-1. Wretch, what is his glory? Is he ambitious? Does he want promotion? Is he vain, tickled with adulation, exulting and triumphing in his power and sweetness of his vengeance? Pardon me, my maker, for asking these awful questions. And he wrote, 20 times in the course of my reading have I been upon the point of breaking out. This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it. And again, ever since the Reformation, when or where has there existed a Protestant or dissenting sect who would tolerate a free inquiry? Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion to all other sects? Elsewhere, he wrote, there exists, I believe, throughout the whole Christian world, a world which makes it as blasphemy to deny or doubt the divine inspiration of the books in the Old and New Testament, from Genesis to Revelations. In most countries of Europe, it is punished by fire at the stake, or the rack, or the wheel. In England itself, it is punished by boring through the tongue with a red-hot poker. In America, it is not better, even in our own Massachusetts, which I believe, upon the whole, is as temperate and moderate in religious zeal as most of the states. A law was made in the matter in the latter end of the last century, repealing the cruel punishments of the former laws, but substituting fine and imprisonment upon all those blasphemers upon any book of the Old Testament or the New. Now, what free inquiry, when a writer must surely encounter the risk of fine or imprisonment for adducing any argument for investigating the divine authority of these books? And he said, when philosophic reason is clear and certain by intuition or necessary induction, no subsequent revelation supported by prophecies or miracles can supersede it. And in the formation of the American governments, it will never be pretended that any persons employed in the service had interviews with gods or were in any degree under the influence of heaven. This is a clause from the Treaty of Tripoli, which was passed unanimously by the United States Senate and signed by President Adams on June 10, 1797, which states, among other things, that the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. Thomas Jefferson, nominally an Anglican, was a skeptic who wrote many attacks on the clergy and who was denounced as a howling atheist, a hardened infidel, and an enemy of religion. In the Jefferson Bible, by using scissors and paste, he compiled those passages from the Gospels that he believed would give an authentic account of the life and teachings of Jesus. Rejecting the church's supernatural dogmas, including the belief that Jesus was divine, he concluded that Jesus was rather a teacher of the most sublime and benevolent code of morals that has ever been offered to man. In this compilation, he omitted what he regarded as the superstitions, fanaticisms, and fabrications, as he called them, that perverted the Gospels. Jefferson befriended English Unitarian leaders, deniers of the Christian Trinity, and called himself a Unitarian. He also was ranked among the deists, the Enlightenment era thinkers who rejected Christianity, but felt that they perceived God in the vastness and intricacies of nature. Publicly, Jefferson was reticent about his disbelief, but he expressed it boldly in dozens of private letters to his friends. He also revealed hints of doubt in his only full-length book, Notes on the State of Virginia, published in London in 1787. In this work, Jefferson noted that Christian conflicts had killed millions, and it did no harm for a person, as he said, to say there are 20 gods or no God. Jefferson's colleagues were well aware of his disbelief. President John Quincy Adams wrote of Jefferson in his diary in 1831, if not an absolute atheist, he had no belief in a future existence. All his ideas of obligation or retribution were bounded by the present life. Biographer Fawn Brodie concurs. No other statesman of his time could match Jefferson in his hatred of the established faith, his distrust of clergymen as factionalists, systematizers, and imprisoners of the human spirit continued to his death.
I don't know.
As a Virginia legislator and governor, Jefferson led efforts to separate church and state. He succeeded in disestablishing his Anglican denomination as the official state church and wrote the Virginia Act for Religious Freedom, outlawing religious tests for citizens. Jefferson's words, engraved on his memorial in Washington, vowing eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man, were directed as much against the clergy as against kings and emperors. During his presidential campaign in 1800, Jefferson was repeatedly and vehemently denounced as an atheist, accusations which continued until his death and for decades afterwards. We have quotes from his private letters also. In a letter to John Adams, he wrote, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his father in the womb of a virgin will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter." In a letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, he wrote, "The clergy had a very favorite hope of ordaining an establishment of a particular form of Christianity throughout the United States. And as every sect believes its own form the true one, every one perhaps hoped for his own, but especially the Episcopalians and the Congregationalists. The returning good sense of our country threatens abortion to their hopes, and they believe that any portion of power confided to me will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe rightly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." And he wrote in a letter to Baron Alexander von Humboldt, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their political as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes." In a letter to his nephew Peter Carr, he said, "Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage to reason than that of blindfolded fear." A letter to John Adams, he wrote, "It is too late in the day for men of sincerity to pretend to believe in the Platonic mysticisms that three are one and one is three, and yet that the one is not three and the three are not one. But this constitutes the craft, the power, and the profit of the priests. Sweep away their gossamer fabrics of factitious religion, and they would catch no more flies." Another letter to John Adams, he said, "To talk of immaterial existences is to talk of nothings. To say that the human soul, angels, God are immaterial is to say that there are nothings, or that there is no God, no angels, no soul. I cannot reason otherwise, without plunging into the fathomless abyss of dreams and phantasms. I am satisfied and sufficiently occupied with the things that are without tormenting or troubling myself about those which may indeed be, but of which I have no evidence." In a letter to Mrs. M. Harrison Smith, "I have ever judged of the religion of others by their lives, but this does not satisfy the priesthood. They must have a positive declared assent to all of their interested absurdities. My opinion is that there would never have been an infidel had there never been a priest." A letter to Samuel Kercheval, "But a short time elapsed after the death of the great reformer of the Jewish religion, Jesus, before his principles were departed from by those who professed to be his special servants, and perverted into an engine for enslaving mankind and aggrandizing their oppressors in church and state. The purest system of morals ever before preached to man has been adulterated and sophisticated by artificial constructions into a mere contrivance to filch wealth and power to themselves. And in a letter to William Short, he wrote, "My aim in compiling Christ's humanitarian maxims, the Jefferson Bible, was to justify the character of Jesus against the fictions of his pseudo-followers, the follies, the falsehoods, and the charlatanisms which his biographers father upon him. That Jesus did not mean to impose himself on mankind as the Son of God, physically speaking, I have been convinced." In a letter to Thomas Whittemore, he wrote, "Creeds have been the bane and ruin of the Christian church, its own fatal invention, which, though through so many ages, made of Christendom a slaughterhouse, and at this day divides it into castes of inextinguishable hatred to one another." A letter to the rector of his church, the Reverend Charles Clay. "Of publishing a book of religion, my dear sir, I never had an idea. I should as soon think of writing for the reformation of Bedlam as of the world of religious sects. Of these there must be at least 10,000, every individual one of which believes all wrong but his own." A letter to Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse included this sentiment: "I am anxious to see the doctrine of the one God commenced in our state, but the population of my neighborhood is too slender and is too much divided into other sects to main any one preacher well. I must therefore be contented to be a Unitarian by myself, although I know there are many around me who would become so if once they could hear the question fairly stated." And in a letter to Richard Price, "I concur with you strictly in your opinion of the comparative merits of atheism and demonism, and really see nothing but the latter in being worshipped by many who think themselves Christians." Quoted by Cardiff, "Calvin's religion was demonism. If ever a man worshipped a false god, he did. The god is a being of terrific character, cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust." From the Virginia Act of Religious Freedom, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship place or ministry whatsoever." And again, the impious presumption of legislators, rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world through all time." And in his notes on the state of Virginia, "Millions of innocent men, women, and children, since the introduction of Christianity, have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned, yet we have not advanced 1 inch toward uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To take one half of the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. Again, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And again, every state, says an inquisitor, has established some religion. No two, say I, has established the same. Is this a proof of the infallibility of establishments?" On to James well, should be a picture here of Madison, but I guess it's missing. Madison, living historian Irving Brandt states that Madison left Virginia to attend Princeton University, which he selected for its hostility to episcopacy. Madison never became a church member, but in maturity he expressed a preference for Unitarianism. As a young man, Madison engaged in furious denunciation of the imprisonment of nearby dissenters from the established Anglican Church. Making common cause with Jefferson and others, he worked to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia, to cut it off from tax support and from exclusive legal status. In 1784, he worked with Jefferson to defeat a bill to give tax money to the churches to provide teachers for the Christian religion. And in his memorial and remonstrance, he wrote, "During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Again, what influence, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instances have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. And again, the purpose of the separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. This was in 1803 in a letter objecting to the use of government land for churches. That's the memorial and remonstrance. James Monroe. Franklin Steiner, in his book, The Religious Beliefs of Our Presidents, categorized Monroe among presidents whose religious views are in doubt. Indeed, Monroe was very close-mouthed about his religious views. Almost nothing on that subject can be found in his speeches or writings. James Monroe left almost no documents or speeches pertaining to religion. David L. Holmes wrote an essay on the religion of James Monroe, which I want to read portions of. Reports that Monroe had a lifelong affiliation with the Episcopal Church, attended services, and participated in the church's rites of passage seem to be factual. Yet over the years, Monroe's biographers have rarely mentioned his religious views. Even those who have written books on the religion of the American presidents have found little to say when they have reached the religion of the fifth president of the United States. And there is a reason for this dearth of material. It is called deism. By political accident, Paine lived in Monroe's home in Paris for a time while Monroe served as minister to France. It is inconceivable that Paine and Monroe did not discuss religion during this period, just as it is inconceivable that Monroe did not discuss religion with his mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Written during 1793 and 1794, partially in the French jail and partially in Monroe's home, Paine's The Age of Reason helped to popularize deism in the United States. Paine wrote the second part, which deals with the Bible, using a King James version borrowed from the Monroes. In Virginia, the center of deism was Monroe and Jefferson's alma mater, the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, an institution where Washington also served as chancellor. Bishop William Meade of Virginia, an Orthodox Episcopalian, remembered in his old church's ministers and families of Virginia, at the end of the century, he said, the College of William and Mary was regarded as the hotbed of infidelity and of the wild politics of France. The intimacy produced between infidel France and our own country by this union of our arms against the common foe was most painful in its influence on our citizens, generally, and on none more than those of Virginia. The grain of mustard seed, which was planted at Williamsburg about the middle of the century, had taken root there and sprung up and spread its branches over the whole state. Holmes' essay continues, in the 18th century, as today, students and young people generally embraced the popular ideas of their time. Thus, it would be surprising if deism had not influenced the founding fathers, for all were young men when it began to spread. Washington was born in the 1730s, Jefferson in the 1740s, and Madison and Monroe in the 1750s. Jefferson studied at William and Mary in the 1760s. Monroe enrolled at William and Mary in the 1770s. And though Washington never attended college, he moved in the circles of gentry who had been educated at William and Mary and at other colleges. Only Madison, who graduated from the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, in the early 1770s, and considered entering the ministry while there, attended a college known for most of the 18th century for its Christian orthodoxy. Yet Madison returned to Virginia from Princeton. His religious beliefs seem clearly to have moved in a deistic direction. Bishop Meade, who knew the Madison family well, attributed James's change to his political associations within those of infidel circles, of whom there were many in his day. As these words indicate, most of the political leaders who advocated independence from Great Britain and who designed the new American government were in one way or another influenced by deism. They did not hold identical views. Deism had wings, and the founding fathers should not be lumped together. But if census takers had set up broad categories labeled atheism, deism and Unitarianism, Orthodox Protestantism, Orthodox Roman Catholicism, and others, and if they had interviewed Monroe, Franklin, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, they would have undoubtedly placed every one of those 6 founding fathers in some way under the category of deism and Unitarianism. Monroe's public statements and speeches were remarkably silent about religious matters. Neither his public utterances nor his writings, including his autobiography, cite the Bible, nor do they make any references to Jesus Christ. When his speeches refer to the deity, he uses only stock deistic phrases. But nothing of the sort appears in Monroe's extant letters of advice. When he wrote detailed letters advising his nieces and nephews how to live happily and productive lives, he included no comments about spiritual matters. When James Monroe Jr., the son of Monroe's brother Joseph Jones Monroe, who became unruly while at West Point, Monroe sent him a detailed letter full of advice. But the letter mentions neither God nor religion. Even though Monroe had many connections in New York, he did not counsel his nephew, as was the custom in such letters, to see any noted ministers or to visit certain churches. When his only son, James Spence Monroe, died at the age of 16 months in 1800, Monroe was clearly crushed. The funeral service and burial were at St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond, the family church when Monroe was governor. But the letters Monroe wrote to others about his little son's death include no references to the consolations of religion. When his wife Elizabeth died in 1830, Monroe wrote to a number of their friends saying how devastating her death was, but failed to mention any religious beliefs that may have proved comforting. In contrast, when Adams and Jefferson exchanged letters upon the death of Abigail Adams, both spoke of the consolations of a future state where they would meet loved ones again. But this one item is known about Monroe that may shed additional light on his religious beliefs. He was a Freemason. The ties between deism and Freemasonry were close. Neither his private nor his public writings suggest that he ever experienced a sense of the mystery or awe that was at the heart of Orthodox Christianity. No evidence exists to show that he was an active or emotionally engaged Christian. Like Washington, Monroe was neither a philosophical nor a highly intellectual man. A practical, problem-solving person, he was highly effective when he worked on practical matters. Unlike Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, he did not seem to spend extensive time considering why the universe was so. Franklin wrote a letter shortly before his death giving his views of Jesus. Adams typically went to his Unitarian church twice on Sunday and considered himself a church-going animal. Jefferson was on a religious quest all his life, and Madison remained sufficiently interested in religious subjects that Jefferson asked him to draw up a list of theological books for the library of the new University of Virginia. But Monroe's life fails to display any of these interests, hence his personality traits may explain the lack of information historians have about his spiritual side. Just a brief quote from John Quincy Adams. There is in all Christian denominations a time-serving, cringing, subservient morality as wide from the spirit of the gospel as it is from the intrepid assertion and vindication of the truth. So in fact, half a century after the nation's establishment, clergymen complained that no president to that date had been a Christian. In a sermon that was reported in the newspapers, Episcopal minister Bird Wilson of Albany, New York, protested in October 1831. Among all our presidents from Washington downward, not one was a professor of religion, at least not more than Unitarianism. I could give you some quotes about Abraham Lincoln as well. No school child is taught that Lincoln rejected Christianity and never joined a church, or that he wrote a treatise against religion, but he did. And after his death, many clergy represented Lincoln as a pious Christian. And there is a photograph there is a photograph of Lincoln examining a book of Matthew Grady photos with his son Tad that was widely distributed in churches with the misleading caption, Lincoln reading the Bible to his son. That's not what it was about. The Mary Todd Lincoln, after Lincoln's death, said Mr. Lincoln had no faith and no hope in the usual acceptation of these words. So, the French philosophes, contemporaries of the Founding Fathers, had views summarized this way by Will Durant, and this would be more or less how the Founding Fathers saw the matter. Behind the support that Christianity had given to morality, they saw 1,000 heretics burned at the stake, the Albigensians crushed out in a homicidal crusade, Spain and Portugal darkened with autos da fe, France torn apart by rival mythologies, and all the future of the human spirit subject in every land to the repeated resurrection of superstition, priestcraft, and persecution. So, hence we have the First Amendment appearing in our Constitution. This ends my talk. I'll be happy to entertain questions if there are questions.
Tour de force.
Well, thank you.
Very impressive.
How did we get to "In God We Trust" on things like our money?
That was passed sometime in the 1950s during the McCarthy era.
I thought it was Eisenhower had a hand in that.
He may have been part of it.
Yeah.
David, can you exit full
Have
screen?
you followed the work of the Jesus Seminar starting in the late 1990s?
I have read
in
their
which
work, yes.
Lots of
followed it.
questions
Yes,
have
they
been
raised
raised by so-called Christians.
similar questions.
David, can you exit a share screen?
What would you like to see?
No, it exits share
I
screen.
see. Let's see. I'm not sure where that is here.
The very top.
Very top where you,
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Excellent. Thank you.
you're welcome. I wonder about the the comments about Priestley. It's interesting to me. My understanding of Priestley is that the fundamental kind of outrage against Priestley was not, even though there was some theological foment, was fundamentally his support for the French Revolution.
I believe that's the case. He was a
And-
supporter of the French Revolution, and people didn't like that.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating his comments about Franklin, because it was Franklin's invitation that brought him to the United States
Mhm.
and to Northumberland,
Mhm.
which makes that a fascinating kind of counter or sub story to that incident.
There were a lot of relationships, a web of relationships among these people.
Yeah.
Did some of these people, who are the people you described, who did spend time in Europe in that general period, put their lives at risk by being in Europe rather than within the safety of the United States?
I presume they were in England and in France and were not discussing religion openly. And some of them had diplomatic status, so that would have helped.
What, in your research, David, one of the things that I didn't hear you mention, which I assume was prominent in the minds of our earliest leaders, was the Great Awakening, and the emotional foment in religious circles that was happening that would have been anathema to many of our founding fathers' religious sensibilities if they had them.
I haven't focused on that aspect of it, and I don't think they have referred to it. We're focused on the abysmal history of religious persecutions in Europe.
David, thank you for your talk. That question leads to mine. I understand that Jefferson once said that the natural religion for the American people after the founding of the Republic was Unitarianism. And
He may have believed that, but it didn't turn out to be true.
well, that's my question, and maybe it's the Great Awakening as a sign. It seems to me that the founding fathers were dominated by political thinking, and they rather assumed that if they could establish a free and secure government, that the natural intelligence of human beings would incline them to a rational religion like Unitarianism. But instead what happened was that beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the people on the frontiers all gravitated to fundamentalist religions, camp meetings and fire and brimstone and so on. However, it seems to me that 200 years later, in the present, something like what the founding fathers imagined has actually happened. Millions of people are really shedding religion as incomprehensible, and I'm always a little struck by children who will just say coldly, "I'm an atheist."
Where are you meeting these children?
What?
Where are you meeting these children?
Well, my wife's son, for instance, his son, his boy, and the students. I've been a college professor, so very few people seem to have this strength to openly challenge religion as the founding fathers so eloquently did. People are more quiet about it, but basically, it seems to me that millions of people, especially in Europe and less so here, but still millions and millions of people, just don't believe the Christian doctrines. I notice that if you talk to students and quote the Bible, they do not know what you're talking about. If you mention any doctrine like the incarnation or the resurrection, they just don't know what that is, and they're not interested in it. So
they've been raised in an atmosphere where that was considered irrelevant.
Yeah.
I'm not certain though. For me though, the issue around that is, I think it's a misnomer to think that they're non-religious or they're non-spiritual. I think is better apt. The reality is most of them have shunned traditional religious institutions in favor of a spirituality of the marketplace, in the sense that they are, these are the same kids that are taking up yoga and taking up Zen meditation and other forms of what we would refer to as religious expression or spiritual disciplines, but outside the context of the formality of religious institutions.
Yeah.
I would make one comment relating to, Joseph, your assertion that the Enlightenment did not go west of the Alleghenies. Abraham Lincoln is a fine example of the Enlightenment west of the Alleghenies. He was from Illinois. I guess he was born in Kentucky, if I remember. In his younger days, a young man as a lawyer, he wrote a treatise against religion, and he circulated it amongst some of his friends, and they would discuss it around the Cracker Barrel in the general store. And one day, one of his friends there, I think it was the proprietor of the store, took hold of that treatise, opened the door of the stove, and fired it in there, because he said, it is not safe for you as an aspiring young political leader to be publishing this kind of stuff. So, Lincoln was, throughout his adult life, a free thinker.
And from a geographical standpoint, American humanism was born on the plains, not in New England. And so one would have to take into consideration the experience that were in the middle of the continent as a precursor to the development of American humanism.
You mean like Robert Ingersoll?
Ingersoll, but within our own movement, you think about Henry Nelson Lyman and some of the others that were out in Chicago, and some of the Potter and
Dietrich.
Dietrich and so forth, who were there, and then who was in Spokane? David, was that Dietrich?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either. That's not the Plains, but that's about as far away as you can get. So,
Dave, the founding fathers occasionally and Lincoln very often invoked God in his oral presentation, his speeches. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
That was a political tactic. It was expected of them, and they did it. I think free thinkers have a tendency to conform outwardly to some extent to because of peer pressure to satisfy the expectations of the society around them.
Because I just read a book about Washington in the context of the Battle of Yorktown and what led up to it, and he like most football coaches, God is on his side when he made certain decisions. It was interesting. Now, maybe that's the author's take on it, but I think the author was quoting some of his, I think he accurately quoted Washington on some of the occasions. He was very lucky, for instance, that some small ships and boats showed up when he needed them in order to take the troops from the northern Chesapeake down to the southern Chesapeake for the battle, for instance, and things like this. But anyway.
Washington was not an out-and-out atheist. He was a deist.
Hmm.
So he had some kind of God concept operating.
Yeah.
I find it curious how our current president is able to rally a huge religious movement behind him in spite of his own personal beliefs. There's an example there of a president invoking the word of God to his advantage there.
Well, if you recall some of the quotations from the founding fathers, this is exactly what they say would happen. That trying to use religion to support political causes would result in corruption on both sides of the altar.
and probably is an indication of the experience of the Great Awakening. I would argue we are in the midst of another Great Awakening that is religio-political as opposed to just simply political, at least in the South.
Could I tell you a brief personal story that happened to myself that pretty much began proving to me that many of the members of Christian churches do not accept all of the teachings at all. My own personal story is the following. When I was 17 years old and ready to head off as a member of the United States Navy in World War II. By the way, I'm now 95 years old. So I served in the Navy in World War II. When I headed off, I had some opportunity to talk to our Episcopal priest in Church of the Messiah in Oneyville in Providence, Rhode Island. And I told him point blank, I do not believe, I do not accept the miracles described in the Bible. And his answer to me was very simple. He said, Ed, don't let that bother you. Just keep attending church and you will find something in your church experience that will be valuable to you. He was basically saying, don't worry, you can find your own beliefs within a Christian church, even if they're not directly equal to those beliefs of the Christian church. And we are currently members of a Lutheran church. And it turns out, I would make a reasonable guess that a good many of us do not accept all of the teachings. But we have some value in the church. It helps us to organize, to be good to people, to love people, to help people. And in a sense, the experience is such that we can exist within that kind of a Christian church that looks to us to be helpful to people. And so my experience dates back to my age 17, heading off for warfare in the Navy during World War II. And I'm told by a priest, don't worry about it, Ed. If you don't believe all those things, don't worry. Come to church anyway, and you can find a valuable experience. And that's something that has lived with me for years and years, that simple statement. Ed, don't worry about your lack of belief in those details. Come to church anyway, you'll find something valuable. And by the way, I have found many things valuable, even though my feelings are still the same. I still don't believe that the miracles described happened at all, but that doesn't bother me. And an Episcopal priest years ago said, Ed, don't let it bother you. Just join with us.
Ed, I'm sure that you have lots of company in your outlook toward religion and your relationship with churches, and not just among the lay members of the congregations, but among the clergy as well.
Marvelous story.
I'd like to add a comment to what, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
I'd like to add a comment to what Ed says. Sometimes if I'm in a church, I look around at the congregation, usually from the back, and I say to myself, there are as many views of the universe and life as there are people in the church. And once you dig a little below the surface of what people would say were formal beliefs, I think there's a tremendous amount of idiosyncratic belief. And I've always felt like that. So I was very interested to hear what Ed had to say about discriminating between the values, say, of a church and the formal doctrines. If in fact you think of coming up to the Reformation, the Catholic Church had really set up a lot of colleges that inevitably ended up as universities, and they taught masses and masses of young men to be priests. And once you do that, you'll find that they will eventually question the doctrines that they're being taught, and they will split. And you find that certainly standard in Protestantism, that indeed, if people don't like the views of a certain denomination, they'll go off and find the views of a different one. And certainly there's a tremendous amount of suppression involved in how people have to keep a lot of the areas of their views to themselves. So I was thinking of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton really was someone who surprised people when, after his death, individuals went through a lot of his manuscripts, and he was much more interested in alchemy and theology than he was in what we think of as his physics and his mathematics. And obviously, you could say that he was a secret Unitarian. And I think I find the same thing about Voltaire. You know, Voltaire we think of as someone who's very rational, but if you dig enough in Voltaire's mind, you see he was anti-Semitic. He had prejudices of the day. So it's interesting to listen to your talk. And your talk reminded me of how I think at any time in society, you get that whole range of people, maybe like Lucretius, who believe everything's just empty space and atoms. Or you have people who believe still in the value of Greek myths and other myths. And many people in society at any time believe those. I mean, I open the newspaper and I see the astrological column. I never read it, but there it is. And I'm always reminded when people say, oh, today the astrological column talked about what would happen to me, and I think such and such will happen. So I think there is a tremendous amount of views ranging from sort of rationality and science in certain forms, but that doesn't mean in any sense that the mythic views are not even held in possibly in some contradictory sense by individuals.
I think you're onto
So
something.
I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you. I think you're onto something by your realization that in every church there is a wide range of views on various topics. And I think the churches down through history have made a mistake in trying to legislate conformity against human nature, which is not well suited to everybody thinking the same.
You know, I wonder if there's also a sociological component to this in terms of what you were talking about, Malcolm. And that is, I think about where the things like the Great Awakening and other moments of religious fervor spread in this country. They did not spread fundamentally among the population of scientists and those who were university educated and so forth. They spread among people who had been marginalized in their communities. Who, you know, I'm thinking of the most recent book on white trash, 400 years of the history of the way we've marginalized people in this country. And wonder whether or not part of what we're dealing with here is the difference between folks who had access to educational means and those who didn't, and who found it empowering to believe in the way that gave them a sense that they were loved and empowered in ways that science was not available to them. And other means of power and so forth were not available to them.
Like the Shakers.
Yeah.
Or Unitarians. I mean, take Priestley, for instance. Unitarians in England in the 18th century were not allowed to go to the universities in England. Some would go up to Scotland. But a lot of Unitarians, as you must know, set up their own educational colleges so that people like Priestley could teach in those colleges because they couldn't go into Oxford and Cambridge. And the same went for the Catholic population. You couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge until the 1870s. Yeah.
Manchester College in England is the primary example of that.
Yeah. I was brought up in Northern Ireland, so these things come to mind.
But I tell another brief personal story. And it concerns a young Lutheran pastor describing what we call the Holy Communion, the body and blood of Christ. And in his description, he said the following. Remember now, this is a young Lutheran pastor. And he said, folks, we are neither cannibals nor vampires. We do not eat flesh and drink blood. And the minute he said that, I suddenly realized here was a friend of my own. Quote unquote.
Marvelous, marvelous.
Well, I sometimes wonder where people will go for a modern myth. I sense that the people are, including me, are hungry for religion. But every form I encounter, I find dissatisfying. But I believe that in the future, no religion can stand that is inconsistent with modern empirical science, nor with nationalism. I think people will be drawn, maybe I'm like Jefferson looking for Unitarians in the future, but I think people will be drawn to the mysteries of science, especially as as the space program discovers life elsewhere in the universe. I certainly am. I find that believable, and I explore that at every opportunity. The exploration of space and the Hubble Space Telescope and the Museum of Space and Aviation down in Washington and so on. But I don't encounter many people who seem to have that inclination. They're much more interested in going back to some of the old, maybe as Malcolm was saying, that the old myths. There are people who dress up like witches. I forget I forget the name of it now, but there's a
Wicca.
What?
Wicca.
The Wicca, yeah. Honestly, this is the wrong direction to go, in my judgment. I do find the Greek myths fascinating. I love to keep track of them, and I noticed that in astronomy, we're still well, like the source of the Geminid meteors. It's actually an asteroid which has been named the Phaeton. Well, Phaeton was a son of Zeus.
Yes.
Yeah, the Phaeton, and you know, it's this is charming and quite harmless, I think. I once got to Greece, and I confess I never was able to climb Mount Olympus to look for the gods. I never got around to it. I think I assumed that they just wouldn't be there. But you know, I sense there's an emptiness in our society and in our world population, and people are looking for something to believe. And with all due respect to the Abrahamic religions, we haven't seemed to touch it yet. I imagine it's space. It could be international life, which is what I work for.
I appreciate your concern, Joe, for those people who are seeking out those old myths. But to be honest, I have much more compassion for them than the people who are seeking out the new myths, like QAnon and the like, that are born of the new age of the internet.
There is an institute, Joseph, that you would be very drawn to called the Institute for Religion in the Age of Science, that has an annual gathering, used to be on Star Island. I don't know where they're at now.
I worked there once.
Yeah, quite a remarkable group of scientists and theologians that gather to be in dialogue around these very issues.
It was too expensive to go back.
Yeah, I went once myself and then realized that.
I'm very interested in what the biologists call emergence. Um, and this is kind of a successor to the theory of evolution, natural selection.
That was actually one of the topics of the IRAS a number of years ago.
Yeah, yeah. It's the Gaia hypothesis is sort of in that ballpark. This idea that, well, in fact, I've just done a study called reductionist materialism. I taught history of science and technology, and after years of study, it all came down to reductionist materialism. And in fact, I'd kind of like to present this to the Torch Club someday. I don't really want to get into this, but I don't think that the solution is to just bring back the Creator, God the Father, nor any of the other religious symbols. But what we do need is a theology for our time, and I think people will forge this. Some of the biologists working in the field of emergence, I'll go into that sometime, maybe on that path.
I think there have been theologians that have been on that path for years. I think about, Henry Nelson Wyman and his writings about creativity. I think about Alfred North Whitehead and his theologies related to, the wedding of mathematics and theology and so forth.
Process
theology.
I just read the Henry Bergson. I'm retired now, and I read a lot of big books that I postponed for too long. But Time and Free Will by Henri Bergson is a marvelous book. And it's very informed about science, but it does think that we have misunderstood time. He calls it duration. And if the physicists are wrong about the four-dimensional space-time continuum, there might be some new way to go. I find this all just very tantalizing.
Fun.
You've got a second career, Joseph.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and David, this was a wonderful talk. Before we wrap up, I'd like to give a chance for anybody who hasn't aired an opinion to do that now. So if you haven't expressed any questions or thoughts or ideas, please do so now, if you haven't spoken. Okay.
Let me just say before we go that it's been a pleasure visiting with all of you.
Thank you. David.
Likewise.
David, I hope we can have you and Linda back for come to church. As there are plentiful people here from the church that would have you come as guests when we get back together in person as well.
I may have something to say, perhaps another time.
That would be wonderful. We welcome that. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Our next torch is going to be a speaker to be announced, and will occur at 7 p.m. instead of 6 p.m. Okay?
Can I have my supper now?
Yeah. Then we can eat beforehand.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Bye.
Take care,
Okay,
everyone.
thank you.
Thank you,
Bye.
buddy.
Thank
Goodbye, goodbye.
Nice to see everybody.
Likewise.
A new experience for all of us. My goodness. I would never have believed this 2 years ago.
I hope you enjoyed it.
As one of the founders of the semiconductor industry, I don't know whether to be overjoyed that semiconductors allow this or encourage it or make it possible. But anyway, that's life. And it's no miracle. It took a lot of hard work.
Sure.
Wonderful. Okay, good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.
Good night, good night.
Good night.